Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Rouge Rugby podcast, where we talk about real Canadian rugby. I'm Stu Hardy, joined once again by Jeff and Ed. Fellas, we have made it through the quarterfinals, and Canada is still going strong. Emphasis on strong after their performance against Australia. I know that in last week's episode, I mentioned that I was, a bit on the fence of how Canada were going to do, especially after all their pool games in which they'd been, a bit slow to start. I mean, it all turned out well for them in the end, and especially as well as Australia were the first team to score first against England and actually have a lead against England for the first time this tournament. Those fears were completely unfounded when Asia Hogan Rochester went over in the second minute, so never mind. Um, but yeah, I think that the concern had been from not only like the Canadian fans, but the Canadian team themselves was that, they were letting opportunities slip because they just weren't firing on all cylinders when they needed to at the start. But yeah, it all came together pretty well. I mean, Sophie de Goody in another player of the match performance, proving that she can be a back rower, be a lock, kick from the tee, and also be scrum half as well. Just coming in covering every single position. But yeah, an absolutely monumental victory that not only progresses Canada into the semi-finals of this Rugby World Cup, but automatically qualifies them for the 2029 World Cup in Australia. So that's pretty impressive in the space of, what is it, like 2 weeks? Canada has been able to qualify for two World Cups, and both of them are in Australia. But I'll go over to you first, Jeff. What did you make of this game? What really stood out for you?
Well, I think it was a bit more of a polished performance, and I know you're just speaking about Australia scoring first against England, which has ruined England's never trailing in this World Cup stat. And but I believe at the end of near the end of the game on Saturday, I actually saw a stat that Canada hasn't trailed yet, I believe, in this World Cup. So, hopefully that. Other than that, I thought it was a bit more polished performance. I think you always have to wonder about these pool games sometimes when like I know Scotland was not a given, but the other two were you would expect the result to go one way. Is just how do the players stay focused and they're trying to keep themselves mentally, not just physically fresh, but mentally fresh for these games too. And
Mhm.
that's kind of like what I think this World Cup has been going, and then Canada's trying to peak at this time.
Mhm.
So I would think it was a great result. Only giving up one try to Australia is probably my favorite stat of that game, to be honest. I know one other little story. After the game, my sister texted me and said, "Did you see the result of the Australia game?" I'm like, "Yes." Oh, she's like, "Are you surprised?" I wrote back, "No." I'm not. I expected them to win pretty comfortably. Maybe
Mm.
give up another try or two. But I would say I did expect a comfortable win. And so I think in one way, my favorite stat of the game really is the only giving up the one try to Australia.
Mm. Yeah. I think before watching this game, I rewatched the highlights from the Pacific Four Series earlier this year, where Canada got the try bonus point on like the stroke of half time. This was when it was all determined by like point difference and basically who of Canada or New Zealand could beat their opponents the most, which turned out to be New Zealand in that instance. But watching that game of just Canada being able to get that try, that fourth try, just on the stroke of half time, I was thinking, okay, that's the benchmark you have to set for yourselves. That has to be, you know, that or better. And clearly it was a hell of a lot better. And yeah, I think like I produced a stat of like, Canada have never lost to the Wallaroos. And that stat, long may it continue, because I got Canada exactly where they needed to be. Ed, talking about stats and figures, and you know, Sophie de Goody has been. extending her stat legacy at this World Cup. But are there any others that stood out from this game that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, there are a number of really good players in this game. Right across the forward pack, you've got Flo Simon standing out in the backs. But we're at the pointy end of the tournament now. No offense to the other teams, but these are the four teams that we've got in the semifinals now that could actually win the World Cup. Um, I think the one thing that we've seen from Canada throughout the tournament is their forwards just dominating. Coming into New Zealand, I think the Canadian forward pack is better than the New Zealand forward pack, which is a big claim for the reigning against the reigning world champions. But De Goody was great in this game. She was number two in carries, number two in meters, number one in breaks. Defenders beaten. She was number two. She had 100% tackle rate. She's an absolute worldie. Like she is, if not the player of the tournament, the top player in the world right now. Asia Hogan Rochester was great, number one in meters carried. But then we've got Crossley and Menon. Hunt was also really, really great. I think, we talked about last week about who's the number one starting squad for Canada.
Mm.
And we weren't quite sure. I think probably the team that rolled out in that quarter was the number one side. But the upshoot of that we didn't really talk about is that Canada have probably the best bench in the competition. Maybe England getting there as well. But in terms of the players that they can bring on, Abby Senth, Booker Boom, Olivia Apps was top of a lot of the stats as well, just coming on and absolutely breaking the game open at the end. She's dynamite coming on in the second half with tiring bodies. So the Canadian bench, I think, is actually a real, real weapon going into that New Zealand game. As Jeff mentioned, they're peaking at the right time. They've got, very limited injuries in the squad, and that bench there is dynamite. So I'm putting my money on Canada right now to actually win the whole thing. I think against New Zealand, there was an interesting news article that New Zealand have three of their midfielders injured. So they actually run a lot of their attacking structure for their backs. Braxton Sorensen McGee, Portia Woodman, it all goes through the strength of their midfield. Sylvia Brunt is out, so this is actually a big advantage to Canada coming up in this game. And it's great to see that the Canadian backs were looking a bit more fluid, a bit more cohesive, and that plays into what Jeff was saying about them peaking at the right time. So, from a objective standpoint, not just being Canadian fans, I feel like Canada's trending really in the right direction right now. It'll be a great game, I think, coming into New Zealand if they play the same way that they've beaten New Zealand in the last games that they've played them or tied them in that last game. They've got a really good chance of taking this semi-final, going all the way to the final. The other stat I'll mention is that there was 8 turnovers made by individuals, so one turnover from 8 different players in that game. So they're sharing the load across the board. It's not just one person dominating in that ruck area. Everybody's getting in there and making a difference, which is a really great sign that everybody's in form and everybody's playing well.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, obviously, this podcast has a bit of Canadian bias to it. That's why we're talking exclusively about the Canada-Australia game. But I think one of the things that I've found like borderline disrespectful is that Canada have been regarded as dark horses for this competition. And I'm like, the number two in the world. How how dark can this horse be? Seriously. It But another stat that I want to pull out here is that this was the first time across the tournament that Canada elected to go for the posts and a penalty as opposed to taking it into a line out and then ideally into a driving maul. And the commentators on TSN were bringing up the fact of, Canada is healthily in the lead when these penalties were taken, and the focus is winding down the clock, less time available to Australia, but also kind of as you mentioned, like protecting the forwards as well. It's like, yeah, you're already ahead by what, 35 points by the end plus. So do you really need to be exerting more effort, risking potential injury to just still be ahead? I mean, yeah, try stats obviously look lovely and that's all good, but I think the majority of us were in the mindset of, focus is now turning ahead to Friday night. You need to have players available, and even if it's just 60 seconds of respite from taking a shot at post. I think obviously Alex Tessier scoring one of the penalties obviously helps. I think the one at the end went a bit askew, and then Australia chose to run it back before knocking it on. Probably wasn't the intention she had, more so just kick it out more than anything. But I think that is excellent gamesmanship, excellent player management from the players on the team as well. As you mentioned, Ed, we had Olivia Apps racking up the stats despite coming off the bench. I think it's easy to forget the number of players in the squad that also have an Olympic medal in their collection. Because, yeah, we got a lot of silver medalists, but obviously Karen Paquis, she has a bronze medal, and she used all those years of sevens experience to shake off those Australian tacklers and get the final try of the game. I think that was wonderful to watch. If this is going to be her last World Cup, that was a dynamite performance to seal that game out. But yeah, that is where we are now, job done in terms of qualifying for the next Women's Rugby World Cup, but our attention turns ahead to Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Canada will be taking on the reigning, defending world champions, the Black Ferns. And you can watch that game on TSN. We'll give you channel details on our social media accounts as soon as we know it. Right. Now, let's head back to a more comfortable time zone. Let's say mountain time, because all attention turned to Denver for the playoff rounds of the Pacific Nation Cup. So this includes not only the semifinals, but also the fifth and sixth place playoff. And we'll get into that first because, USA are hosting this year, so it's only fair that we bring them into it. They were up against Samoa, not only to secure fifth place, but also looking for World Cup qualification. I don't know what has happened to Samoa over basically like the past couple of years, but they are falling down in terms of quality. I know that a number of players are not available for this competition. But ultimately, you can only play who's in front of you. The final score, Samoa 13, USA 29, and that means that they have secured qualification to the Men's Rugby World Cup in 2027. So, to our neighbors south of the border, congratulations on your qualification. Some of us did it a week ago, but who's counting? Who's really gonna measure those things? So just a reminder, you qualified second of the Americas, and who qualified first again? It escapes me at the moment. But let's move on to the semi-finals of the PNC, where it is Canada versus Fiji, a tier one nation, the defending PNC champions, currently ranked ninth in the world, up against Canada, who I believe are currently ranked 24th. I think this was going to go the way everyone predicted it would go. I think that Canada felt that they could have given more to the game, especially how they played in Japan against Japan. But ultimately, I think we were all preparing for Canada to be going to the bronze medal game more than the gold medal match. Ed, I'll pass it over to you first. What did you make of this result for Canada?
Yeah, I think what's well, the score obviously blew out a bit there, but I think one of the problems that they had is that their game plan that they structured for the early stages of this competition was based around the turnover ability, the defensive ability of some of the players they had in the squad, your Rumbles, your Olmsteads, your Ardrons. They just did not have the same quality coming up against a Fiji side that barely kicked the ball. Fiji was just running everything. So, had they had some of those players, I think that had created this very defensive rucking ability that they we saw earlier in the competition, I think they might have gone a little bit better. But given that they weren't really able to challenge for any of the ball on the ground or slow down any of Fiji's ball, Fiji, they're just too good for that. Fiji, we all know how good Fijian players are. We all know how much dynamic skill they have, offloading, just the ability to get the ball away. You're never going to compete with that if you give them the ball. The other thing that Canada did was kick away their ball at the beginning of the game. So just giving back the ball to Fiji for attacking positions is not a viable winning strategy against a team like that. One thing I think they showed was that their set piece was good. The scrum was actually held up quite well. The Fijian pack is quite a big pack. So I think we've got a couple of props there. I think it was Keith and Martinez were starting. So they did quite well, I think, there to keep the scrum solid. That's a good platform for them to build on going forward. But I think just in the loose was where they really fell down. They were good on the line, scoring a couple of those pushover tries. So that's another area where they've done well. But at halftime, Fiji had run 678 meters to 87 of Canada's. Canada had missed 34 tackles to 6. So you're out of the game. They did better in the second half, but if you give up that much in the first half, you're never gonna stay in it. I did think the refing was interesting. He was, and I know they were at altitude, but you could hear the mic from the ref, and he was puffing the whole match. He didn't appear to have very good fitness, and he was very technical on his calls. He was calling a lot of very minimal, immaterial offside. So that didn't help Canada either. They were down 8-3 in the penalty. So I don't know that helped them either. It just sort of piled on to the attacking flair that Fiji had to knock them out of the game.
Yeah, yeah, I think we all know how that the term Fijian flair has definitely been in rugby lexicon for a while. And understandably, you're under a different coach who maybe doesn't have like the experience or knowledge of playing a team like Fiji, especially modern Fiji, as opposed to, the Fiji of a few World Cup cycles ago, for example. Um, but yeah, I think that there was a lot of things that weren't going Canada's way, but ultimately, this is, for all intents and purposes, a tier one nation up against a tier two nation. And we got and after seeing some of the blowout scores in the Women's Rugby World Cup, it's kind of humbling to see your own nation be on the receiving end of one of those in like men's competition as well. Um, Jeff, you took a look in of this game of the entire duration
Yeah.
and endured, persevered, tortured yourself. How would you describe it?
Started wondering why I was watching. But yeah, even my daughter was like, I don't think Canada's gonna win. I'm like, yeah, yeah. Just the speed of the Fijians to get the ball wide was like that's another thing that's just impressive. It's just I think Canada's forwards tried. I mean, they tried. They tried to get stuck in and they tried to slow down the ball, but Fiji was just recycling and getting the ball wide and I'm not sure if it's just a new defensive structure, but it looked like a lot of like arm tackling by Canada's backs, which is not what you want to do, especially against them. So they were always able to get that pass off like that and just keep the ball alive. And Canada was out of position. The line was no longer flat, the defensive line, I mean. And so it wasn't pretty, but at the same time, Canada did, I guess in a sense, didn't give up. They managed to not give up a point per minute, which was good. Like that. And I guess also just congrats to Brock for his first try in a Canada jersey. So that's about it for now.
On the back of a good a pretty good game from Owaru. I think he is probably Canada's best player when they're missing their international stars. He's come on quite well. He was like the top in running, the top in tackles, top in turnovers. So he's a player that Canada can build their squad around. But
He's one
yeah,
guy that can get them go forward ball in the
yeah.
forwards. I mean, he can't do it himself, as we saw against Japan, but he is definitely one that can get that forward ball for them.
Absolutely. And so here's a question, because we know next year we have the launch of the Nations Championship, which is the Six Nations of men's rugby and the men's rugby championship in that, as well as Japan and Fiji. And there's been talk about this of should Fiji and Japan join the Rugby Championship and compete in basically, I want to say the Southern Six Nations, but Japan is clearly in the Northern Hemisphere. But you know what I mean. Um, Obviously, with the Rugby Championship, they've done it in such a way that I think Japan and Fiji don't play at home for their hosting leg in like the middle of next year. It's all very complex, but when the Rugby Championship returns in 2027, because it's not taking place next year because of this tour of South Africa by New Zealand, the question is, should Fiji and Japan be in a revamped version of the Rugby Championship? And I mean, when you look at Fiji, they are currently ninth in the world, and their opponents are significantly lower than they are. Japan as well, hosted the Men's Rugby World Cup. They have three votes on the World Rugby Council. I think that they also want to be better represented. I think that this may be uh, one of the final years of the current format of the Pacific Nations Cup, just because I think Japan and Fiji are too good to remain in this competition. But I'll throw it to you guys. Ed, you've been nodding along. I assume that means you agree with me.
Yeah, I've been following this closely because obviously Fiji and Japan have been in and out of the top 10 for the past 10 years, have knocked off some huge teams, have huge upsets. Go back to the miracle in Brighton in 2015 where Japan beat South Africa, one of the greatest upsets of all time. And I think that, really catalyzed the conversation around whether Japan should be playing more tier one rugby. Um, I think I think it's a great idea. I think the Six Nations has the best format in the world for a rugby tournament. It's a one-off game that you play each year, so it's anybody's game. Not like two games where when you're playing home and away, very difficult to win two games away at the moment in the Rugby Championship. But I think if they're thinking about syncing up the global calendar, getting everything working so it works better with clubs and countries as well. One of the reasons we talk about Samoa not being very good at the moment is because a lot of their players are not being released by the clubs, or at least being coerced into not releasing themselves for the international windows. So when you got a global season that syncs everything up together better, those players can get released for those bigger matches. You improve the international game. And then, Japan and Fiji, it'll take them a little bit to build up in the Rugby Championship. But Argentina, look at where they've gone from where they started to where they are now. Every team in the Rugby Championship right now has a win and a loss. So it's anybody's Rugby Championship. So I think Japan and Fiji can actually build along that pathway if they're actually allowed entry into it. It'll come down to the bigger countries basically saying, do we want them in here? Are we going to allow them to get in? But I think for the fans, everybody wants it.
Mm. I think one of the things that really benefits like the Six Nations in terms of their format is simply logistics. The three nations are on one island. Then you have another island, which is Ireland, and then you have France and Italy, which obviously share a border as well. Um, Obviously, that's not the same for the Southern Hemisphere and the Rugby Championship. I mean, the closest nations at the moment are Australia and New Zealand, and that's still a 4 hour flight from the closest points for them. So I think that was one of the big issues with the Rugby Championship prior to its current format was you take players, you have games in one game in South Africa, then you have to fly all the way to Argentina and then take 2 weeks off. So I can understand the format they're currently using of we'll play two home games this year and like next year we'll do the reverse fixture twice. I'm hoping that something could be done for like a 6 team rugby championship where you can have visiting teams in close enough proximity that you can just rotate teams once. So you can have, say, New Zealand, Australia, and Fiji, for example, hosting rounds 1 and 2, and it's just their opponents change for that. But obviously, someone else can work out the logistics for a competition like that. Jeff, what are your thoughts on this?
I love the idea of them joining it. I think it'd be great. I think there's no question. But the logistics part is going to be a huge one. Like I
Mm,
understand like the 2 game hosting and then the reverse fixtures that following year because of the travel and the distance and the toll that takes on a player's body. The other issue is, do I want them in? Yes, but only if they can get access to their best players. I think
mm,
Japan probably wouldn't be an issue, but Fiji
mm,
probably would be with yeah for the Premiership in the top 14. Would they get access to those players? Because that's
mm.
what I'm up. Yes.
Yeah, I think the now that the Prem, as it's now known, is down to I believe like 10 teams. They now no longer play during like the international window, but obviously that's not the same for the top 14. They still have club games going on during now for the Rugby Championship, and they'll have games going on during the November series and the Six Nations as well. So I think it is going to be primarily like the French-based players that are going to have like the biggest difficulty in being able to join. But again, this is all hypothetical. But yeah, I think the consensus amongst us is the same that we would love to see Fiji and Japan playing with the best of the Southern Hemisphere in an expanded rugby championship. Now, before we finish, there has been a development from Rugby Canada regarding a national growth plan for the next 5 years. This has been launched by Rugby Canada and the provincial unions, and it has 5 core pillars of action, which are evolve the athlete development pathway to support all ages and stages, introduce and grow non-contact rugby to increase access and retention, focus on youth development to build a stronger base for the sport, invest in women and girls to accelerate equity and opportunity, and build capacity within clubs and provincial unions to sustain progress. I think that so the actual plan itself you can find on the Rugby Canada website, rugby.ca. This addresses one of the things that was mentioned in the National Growth Plan for 24 through to 2029, which is increase the involvement in women's rugby. But that major pillar of focusing on player retention at a club and provincial level is, I think that's really important to see. We've all heard stories of kids once they're getting into high school, they're, no longer interested in the sport. They want to do other things. And I think for a lot of kids, they won't say this out loud, but one of the reasons is they don't want to play a contact sport. They don't want to get injured and miss out on other opportunities whilst at school. So also increasing the non-contact version of the sport as well. I think it's on paper, because it's only just come to fruition, everything sounds great. I know we've had lip service from Rugby Canada before about these kind of things, and afterwards it's left a bit of a sour taste in people's mouths. But it does seem as though there is a united effort between both the national body and the provincial unions as well. And hopefully this is a, rising tide lifts all boats kind of approach. But I want your guys' thoughts. Jeff, what did you think of this documentation?
Well, I mean, it's great to see them trying to increase player retention. That's one of the biggest issues rugby has in Canada, especially in the men's side. It's they go on to different sports, which understandable because some of them know that they can maybe make a living from those sports. That's so it's great that they're going to focus on that. For the player base, sorry, focus needs development. It's also, I know from my city I live in, the club my daughter plays in, they have one of the largest numbers of the really like U9, U7, U5s in the city, which is great to see. But I've seen on other clubs, not that much. And I know some of the clubs in the teenage years have had to merge to put teams on the field.
Mm.
My friend, his two daughters play in what's a merge club in the city with another one. So it's hopefully they can increase those player numbers.
And what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I've been harping on one of these points for a long time now. The non-contact rugby part of it. BC Rugby commissioned a report about 10 years ago that I went to the presentation for, and their findings showed that the number one threat to rugby in Canada is ultimate frisbee. Now, coming from a background where I've sold gear to parents and kids, the number one question is always, oh, what's the best headgear to prevent concussion? So
Mm.
coming from the parents, the concussion conversation is massive. Talk to any parent about, their kids playing sports, and that comes into the conversation pretty much immediately. That's why we see whole swathes of players going and playing a non-contact sport like ultimate frisbee. Rugby's got the perfect solution there in touch rugby. It's such a fun, exciting, fast game that also teaches the skills of contact rugby. So I've been suggesting for a while now that the club scenes in various provinces run a concurrent touch rugby tournament alongside their club tournaments, where players who are not playing, or even players who are playing in the 15s game, play a touch game prior to, and have a whole competition centered around non-contact, where players who don't want to take a concussion risk can actually get in and play and still be connected to the clubs, still have that pathway up to contact if they want it, but also can just play a non-contact option that's available to them as well. So it's good to see that they're looking into that. Hopefully that'll grow further.
Yeah, I agree. And it is early days. This has only just been announced, but I'm hoping this comes to fruition. I hope it makes rugby in Canada much stronger. And I'm glad to see the national and provincial bodies come together on this and unite for the best of the game. So while we may not be able to show you any tag rugby anytime soon, those Canada games that are coming up, which are again the game against the Black Ferns for the women and the game against Tonga for the men, both will be available on TSN, and we will confirm which channels as soon as we know. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out more, as well as our written pieces, on our website, therougerugby.ca. We're also available on Spotify and on YouTube, both at The Rouge Rugby. We're also available across social media, including Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, and Blue Sky. Again, our handle is at The Rouge Rugby. Jeff, where can people find you on social media?
You can find me on X at WP Rugby Jeff.
And Ed, where can people find you?
Facebook and Instagram, rugby101 underscore 2025.
And you can find me across social media at Hardman, spelled H4RDMAN. Well, that's where we're going to end this episode. Jeff, Ed, thank you for joining me, and thank you all for joining us for another episode of the Rouge Rugby podcast, where we talk about real Canadian rugby. We hope you can join us again next time.